The Florida Everglades stretches out at sunrise like a mirror made of grass and slow-moving water. 1.5 million acres of wetland that almost no one will ever set foot in. Somewhere out there in that shallow river of sawgrass, hidden inside protective pens, sat hundreds of small, furry machines that cost the state of Florida millions of dollars. They were robotic rabbits. Each one was engineered to breathe out heat, to leak scent, to twitch like something alive. The state had built them for one reason: to trap the giant snakes that were eating the Everglades alive. And for 2 days, it worked. Then, on the third day, something moved through the water toward those robots that no one had planned for. And the entire experiment turned into something nobody could have scripted. I'm Ambrose Wild, and this is the story of the strangest wildlife experiment Florida has ever attempted. To understand why anyone would drop a robot rabbit army into a swamp, you have to understand what's happening beneath that beautiful surface. The Everglades is one of the most damaged ecosystems in America, and the thing destroying it isn't a chemical spill or a new highway, it's the Burmese python. A constrictor born in the jungles of Southeast Asia, now sprawled across the Florida wetlands like it owns them. And the part almost nobody hears is the strangest part of all. This invasion wasn't nature's doing, it was ours. Back in the exotic pet trade of the 1980s and 90s, baby pythons were sold in Florida pet shops as harmless novelties, small enough to curl up in a child's hand. But those hatchlings grew, and they grew fast. Within a few years, many of them stretched 15 to 20 feet, strong enough to overpower a full-grown deer or wrestle an alligator. Owners who never expected a monster in the spare bedroom started dumping them into canals and swamps. Then, in 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida and smashed open reptile breeding facilities, releasing an unknown number of snakes into the wild. Those escaped pythons became the founding population of an empire. For a predator like this, the Everglades was paradise. Endless warmth, endless water, and prey animals that had never evolved to fear a giant constrictor. With no natural enemies and the ability to lay up to 100 eggs at a time, their numbers exploded across South Florida. Biologists now estimate tens of thousands of pythons hidden in the sawgrass, maybe hundreds of thousands. And what they did to the food web is genuinely disturbing. In the areas where pythons took over, raccoons, opossums, and marsh rabbits didn't just decline, they nearly vanished. Populations crashing by over 90%. One python was found with an entire adult deer inside its stomach, its body stretched grotesquely around an animal that should have been far too large to swallow. Another was filmed in a canal locked in a death struggle with an alligator, a fight so violent that both animals died. And the damage rippled outward from there. Fewer small mammals meant less food for the native hawks and owls circling above the sawgrass. Fewer scavengers meant carcasses lingered in the water and the soil itself began to change. An entire wetland was quietly unraveling, and the creature pulling the threads loose was a snake that was never supposed to be there. So Florida went to war, and the first weapon they reached for was people. In 2013, the state launched the Python Challenge, a massive public hunt with cash prizes and headlines. A call for anyone brave enough to wade into the swamp with a machete and a flashlight. Hundreds of hunters came out for it. And after weeks of effort in the muck and the heat, the grand total of snakes removed was 68. 68 out of tens of thousands. It was a media event, not a solution. So the state got more professional and created the Python Elimination Program, paying licensed contractors an hourly wage plus bonuses to patrol the levees at night.
It helped,
But the math was brutal. For every snake a hunter pulled out of the water, it felt like 2 more slid in to replace it. They even tried something colder, fitting female pythons with radio trackers and turning them loose to lead hunters back to the breeding grounds. They called them Judas snakes. It worked a little. It wasn't enough. The Everglades was simply too big. That's when Florida realized brute force was a losing game, and they turned to an older kind of hunter. The state brought in dogs. Trained detection dogs sent into the swamp to do the one thing no human hunter could: smell the invisible trail a python leaves behind in the grass and mud. A faint, musky odour that clings to the sawgrass long after the snake has moved on. And the results came fast. In their first months in the field, the dogs sniffed out large snakes that had slipped past human crews for weeks, tails stiffening and bodies locking rigid the instant they caught the scent. A handler's flashlight would swing over the water, and there in the beam would be the slow ripple of scales the crews had walked right past for hours. The dogs wore cooling vests against the crushing heat and boots to protect their paws from the razor-sharp sawgrass, working ground that also hid alligators and cottonmouths at every turn. But there was a problem nobody wanted to say out loud: scale. A handful of dogs against 1.5 million acres of wetland in 100-degree heat swarming with alligators and venomous cottonmouths. To cover that ground, Florida would have needed hundreds of dog teams costing untold millions. It was a brilliant tool. It was not the answer. But the dogs proved one thing that changed everything. Scent was the key. The snakes could be pulled in by smell. And that idea sent scientists down a much darker road. They started with live bait. Real marsh rabbits, the python's favourite meal, placed in secure pens along known snake trails. The rabbits were protected, but they were terrified. And their fear did exactly what the scientists hoped. Within weeks, pythons began appearing out of the sawgrass, sliding toward the enclosures one after another. The principle was proven. Live prey worked. But the images of trembling rabbits surrounded by giant snakes triggered immediate outrage from animal welfare groups, and under public pressure, the live bait trials were shut down. The scientists couldn't use living animals anymore, so they made a decision that sounds like science fiction. If they couldn't use a real rabbit, they would build a fake one. The project was called the Robo-Rabbit, and each decoy was a small marvel of engineering. Weather-resistant bodies wrapped in synthetic fur, a thermal pad inside that held a steady heat signature almost identical to a living rabbit's 99-degree body temperature. Tiny emitters that released a chemical scent mimicking rabbit musk, drifting on the swamp breeze. Some models even had little motors that twitched the ears and nose. Hidden inside each one was a motion-triggered camera and a transmitter, all of it powered by small solar panels so the machines could run for weeks. Each robotic rabbit cost nearly $4,000 to build, and Florida anchored around 120 of them inside protective pens scattered across the worst python hotspots in the Everglades. The plan was simple: lure the snakes into monitored zones, then send in teams to remove them. And when the first units switched on, nobody knew if any of it would work. The first 2 days were a stunning success. The alerts started pinging almost immediately, and the field cameras captured incredible footage. Massive pythons, some over 15 feet long, gliding straight up to the decoys. They flicked their tongues, tasting the heat and the scent, and then they struck. coiling their bodies around the fake rabbits while the recovery teams moved in and hauled them out. Snake after snake. It was working. The robotic rabbits were doing exactly what they were built to do. And then day 3 happened. An alert came in from a decoy near a deep water canal, and the biologist watching the feed expected another python. Instead, the camera showed a dark, log-shaped mass moving fast through the water. A 12-foot alligator. And the alligator wasn't confused. It was drawn in by the exact same triggers, the heat and the struggle of what looked like an easy meal. In one explosion of water and mud, it charged the pen and crushed a $4,000 machine in a single bite, leaving nothing but shredded synthetic fur floating on the surface. The robots, it turned out, were the perfect lure for everything in the swamp with teeth. And here's what nobody building those rabbits had thought about. Pythons and alligators are ancient rivals. 2 apex predators competing for the same food and the same stretches of territory in the same swamp. Florida had just scattered 120 warm, twitching dinner bells across their shared hunting grounds, and the message those signals sent traveled through the water in every direction. What happened next was almost unbelievable. The alligators learned. They figured out these glowing, warm targets were easy meals and started patrolling toward the decoys on purpose, dragging them under and crushing dozens of the machines, one after another. And the pythons, sensing all those big alligators suddenly crowding around the pens, did the one thing the scientists never wanted. They began avoiding the traps entirely, melting back into the sawgrass. The whole operation was falling apart. The expensive machines were being torn to pieces in the canals. The snakes had stopped showing up. The alerts had gone quiet. And by every visible measure, the robotic rabbit program was a complete and very costly disaster. But those broken machines were hiding a secret. A young data analyst on the team noticed something the rest had missed in the wreckage. The robots weren't just decoys. They were spies. Before every alligator attack, before every ignored trap, each machine's motion sensor and thermal camera had been quietly recording everything that passed by. They weren't just logging python attacks, they were logging python movement, the time of day, the temperature, the direction each snake was traveling. And when the team cross-referenced the data from all 120 units, especially the ones that had never been touched, a pattern rose up out of the swamp that no human had ever seen. The pythons weren't slithering at random across 1 million acres. They were using highways. Specific hidden corridors through the water and the sawgrass, secret routes they traveled between hunting grounds. And the alligators were using the same roads. This is where the story stops being strange and turns into something out of a science fiction film. The scientists took every scrap of that data, every twitch, every failed hunt, every destroyed rabbit, and fed it all into a machine learning system. The AI started hunting for patterns no human could see, and it found one. It began predicting not just where the pythons were, but where they would be at specific times, because it had learned what the pythons were afraid of. The snakes were moving in deliberate patterns to avoid their one real predator, the alligators. The robots hadn't just caught a few snakes, they had accidentally mapped the pythons' entire secret schedule, their movements, their fears, and their hidden routes. Armed with that ghost map, the hunters threw out the old playbook overnight. No more sitting beside a decoy hoping a snake would wander past. Now they used the AI's predictions to go on the offensive, intercepting the pythons on their secret highways, the exact routes the snakes used when they thought nothing was watching. And the results were staggering. They stopped finding snakes one at a time and started finding them in groups. By tracking the movement of the big, mature females along those hidden corridors, the AI did the thing every previous program had failed to do. It led the hunters straight to the breeding grounds. Massive hidden nests buried so deep in the sawgrass and the standing water that no human search party would have ever stumbled onto them in 100 years. Dozens of females coiled together in the mud, thousands upon thousands of eggs, an entire next generation of the invasion sitting in one place, waiting to hatch and spread across South Florida. In a single month using that map, the hunters removed more invasive pythons than the old bounty programs had managed in an entire year. Every failure along the way, every destroyed rabbit, every alligator ambush had been building toward this. The robotic rabbits, even as they were crushed one by one in the jaws of the swamp, had quietly won the war for Florida. They didn't just help the fight, they rewrote it. So did Florida's high-tech gamble accidentally breed a smarter, more elusive super snake? Or did it just find the key to beating the python invasion for good? What do you think the state should try next? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this is the kind of story you can't stop thinking about, subscribe to Wild with Ambrose, where I dig up more insane experiments and true stories exactly like this one. I'm Ambrose Wild. I'll see you in the next one.